I was 7 years old when I first met Elvis. It wasn't the real Elvis, of course, but his music. It was a scorching summer day, and my grandmother, Mrs. T, was shuffling around the kitchen, humming a tune. She slipped an old vinyl record onto the turntable, and the room filled with the sound of Elvis Presley singing Heartbreak Hotel. I remember the way the music made the air feel different, like it was alive and moving around me. "Who's this, Mrs. T?" I asked wide-eyed. "That's Elvis Presley, sweetie. He was a bit of a rebel in his day." I didn't fully understand what she meant by rebel at the time, but I knew I liked the way he sang. There was something powerful and a little bit dangerous about it, even though I was just a kid. Mrs. T saw the look on my face and smiled. "You want to hear more?" she asked. I nodded eagerly, and she played more songs. Hound Dog, Love Me Tender, all shook up. Each one felt like a new adventure. I was hooked. Years later, when I was a teenager, I started digging deeper into Elvis's music. I discovered that Elvis wasn't just a rock and roll icon. He was a chameleon who could sing anything. He didn't just stick to one genre. He sang ballads, blues, gospel, and even country. I realized that the man I had fallen in love with through those old records was much more complex and talented than I had ever imagined. I began to understand why Elvis had such a profound impact on music and culture. He wasn't just a pretty face with a good voice. He was a musical revolutionary. His ability to blend different genres and styles was unparalleled. He took elements from blues, country, and gospel, and created something entirely new and exciting. It was this versatility that kept him relevant and influential long after the initial shock of his rock and roll debut had worn off. But it wasn't just the music that drew me in. I was fascinated by the stories behind the songs. How did a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, become a global sensation? What drove him to push the boundaries of what was acceptable in music and culture? And how did he handle the immense pressure of fame? I started reading everything I could find about Elvis. I learned about his early days at Sun Records, where he recorded some of his most iconic songs. I discovered the controversies and the scandals, the highs and the lows of his career. I read about his movies, his concerts, and his relationships. The more I learned, the more I realized that Elvis's story was far more complex and nuanced than I had ever imagined. One of the things that struck me the most was how Elvis evolved as an artist. In the 1950s, he was the king of rock and roll, but by the 1960s, he had branched out into other genres. He recorded ballads, gospel, and even easy-listening music. Some critics dismissed this as a betrayal of his roots, but I saw it differently. I saw it as a testament to his artistic growth and his willingness to explore new musical territories. Elvis's music continued to evolve in the 1970s, but so did his personal life. The pressure of fame, the demands of his grueling tour schedule, and his struggles with addiction took a toll on him. Yet, even in his later years, he continued to produce powerful and moving music. Songs like American Trilogy and My Way showcased a different side of Elvis, one that was more introspective and emotional. As I delved deeper into Elvis's music and life, I realized that his legacy was far more than just a collection of hit songs. It was a story of passion, creativity, and the human spirit. It was a story that resonated with me on a deep level, and it was a story I wanted to share with others. That's why I decided to write this book. I wanted to explore Elvis's musical legacy from a fresh perspective, one that doesn't just focus on his rock and roll hits, but also delves into the other genres he mastered. I wanted to give Elvis the credit he deserves for his artistic evolution and his influence on music. And most importantly, I wanted to share the story of how a young boy from Mississippi became one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. So, if you're ready, let's dive into the world of Elvis Presley. From his humble beginnings in Tupelo to his final days in Memphis, we'll explore the music, the man, and the legend. It's a journey that will take us through the highs and lows of his career, and it's a journey I can't wait to share with you. When I first stepped into Sun Studios in Memphis, I didn't know I was about to change my life forever. It was July 1953, and I was just a kid, 18 years old, with a dream. People say I went there to make a record for my mom, but the truth is, I was just curious. I wanted to hear my own voice, to see if I had what it took to make music. I walked into the studio, and it was just me and Sam Phillips, the owner. Some folks say it was Marion Kasker, Sam's assistant, who was there, but I remember it being Sam. I paid $4 to record 2 songs. I was wearing my usual dirty khakis and had my hair all greased back. I guess I didn't look like much, but I had a fire inside me that was burning to get out. Sam asked me what kind of music I liked, and I told him, I sing all kinds. It was the truth. I loved everything from country and blues to gospel and rock. I just wanted to find my own sound. I recorded 2 songs that day, My Happiness and That's When Your Heartaches Begin. They were just ballads, and I wasn't sure how they would turn out. But Sam listened to them, and he said something that stuck with me. You have a very interesting voice there. It didn't happen right away, but about 1.5 years later, Sam called me back to the studio. He had a feeling about me, and he wanted to see what I could do. I'll never forget that moment. It was like the world opened up, and I knew this was my chance. Those early recordings at Sun Studios were a mix of hits and misses. I was still figuring out who I was as a musician. Some songs were pure magic, like That's All Right and Blue Moon of Kentucky. When I recorded That's All Right, the studio was alive with energy. Scotty Moore and Bill Black were with me, and we just clicked. It was like we were meant to play together. The song was a blend of country and blues, and it felt right. It was the first time I really felt like I was onto something special, but not every song was a hit. Some of the ballads I recorded were okay, but they didn't have that spark. I was still learning, and I wasn't always sure what worked. Blue Moon and My Happiness were decent, but they didn't capture the fire I felt when I was on stage. I was trying to find my own voice, and it took time. The thing about those early Sun recordings is that they're important because they show my journey. I was experimenting, trying different styles, and figuring out what I wanted to be. Some songs were better than others, but each one was a step forward. It's easy to look back and think everything I did at Sun was gold, but that's not the case. There were misses, but those misses were just as important as the hits because they taught me what I didn't want to be. When I listen to those early recordings now, I hear a kid who was just starting out, full of hope and a little bit of fear. I hear the sound of someone who was learning, growing, and finding his way. And that's what music is all about. It's not just about the hits. It's about the journey, the good and the bad, and the moments that shape who you are. Those recordings at Sun Studios were the beginning of my journey, and they set me on a path that changed my life. They weren't perfect, but they were mine, and they showed the world a glimpse of what was to come. I stepped into the studio for the first time in July 1954, and it felt like stepping into a whole new world. I was just a kid from Mississippi, but I had a dream, and I was ready to give it everything I had. Sam Phillips, the man behind Sun Records, had called me in, and I was determined to make him see what I could do. We started with a couple of ballads. The first one was Harbor Lights. It was a popular song back then, and I thought it would show off my voice. I was a bit nervous, but with Scotty Moore on guitar and Bill Black on bass, I felt more confident. Scotty's playing was a bit fussy, but I tried my best to sing with feeling. The song had a kind of tropical vibe, and I tried to make my voice sound yearning. Sam didn't seem too excited, though. He thought it didn't have the right commercial appeal, and the recording didn't come out for a long time. Next, we tried I Love You Because. It was a country standard, and I wanted to show I could handle that genre too. I slowed it down a lot, maybe too much, and included a spoken section that didn't quite work. Scotty's guitar playing was a bit distracting, and I could tell my inexperience was showing. Sam didn't think this one was right for a single either, so it was shelved for a while. But then, something magical happened. We started fooling around with a song called That's All Right, originally by Arthur Crudup. I changed some of the melody and the lyrics, and we sped it up. I infused it with a harder edge, and suddenly, it didn't sound like anything else out there. Sam knew he had something special. He could see the potential, and we all felt it. We had created something new and exciting. For the flip side, we picked Blue Moon of Kentucky. It was a country waltz, but we turned it into a 4/4 rhythm. I sped it up and gave it a fresh, vibrant sound. It was a transformation that showed how much I could take a song and make it my own. Sam was thrilled, and we knew we had a hit on our hands. Just a few weeks later, the record was out, and it started getting attention. The Memphis Press Scimitar wrote about me, calling me a 19-year-old Humes High graduate with a record that promised to be big. Even Billboard magazine was impressed, saying I comes through with a solid performance on an R&B type tune, and then on the flip side does another fine job with a country ditty. A strong new talent. By August, we were back in the studio, trying to find a follow-up. I tried a song called Blue Moon, a classic from the Great American Songbook. It was a bold choice, and I slowed it way down. Scotty and Bill created this eerie, clip-clopping background, and I sang close to the microphone with lots of echo. I used a falsetto between verses that sent shivers down your spine. It was a haunting, mesmerizing performance, and it showed a different side of me. Sam didn't release it right away, but it became one of my most unique recordings. In September, we were still looking for the right follow-up. I started with Tomorrow Night, another ballad. The recording had a space left for a guitar solo, but it never got added. The master was boring, with a basic cowboy rhythm. It didn't get released until years later, and even then, it was overdubbed with more instruments and backing vocals. The overdubbed version actually worked better, with a bluesy harmonica solo filling the gap. We also tried a song called Satisfied, but it didn't quite work out. The recording was short and it's lost now. It's a shame, because it could have been a great fit for me. It was my first attempt at a gospel number, and I was just getting a feel for it. Those early sessions were a mix of hits and misses, but they showed me that I could create something new and exciting. I learned a lot about myself and my music, and I was just getting started. I stepped into the studio again, ready to lay down some more tracks. First up was I'll Never Let You Go, Little Darlin'. It was a country number, and I knew it backwards and forwards, but for some reason I decided to skip the first verse. I started with the chorus, and I slowed it way down. It was almost like I was in a dream. I sang the second verse, then suddenly doubled the speed for the last chorus. It was a bold move, and I felt like I was on a roll. The slow part had a mysterious feel like Blue Moon, but the fast part was too short. I wished we had more time to play with it, but it was still a cool experiment. Next I tackled I Don't Care If the Sun Don't Shine. This one was by Dean Martin, one of my idols. I didn't really copy his version. I wanted to make it my own. I gave it a country twist, and it felt right. The band and I were really getting into it. I played around with the melody, especially when I sang. At a time like this, who keeps score? The guys would drop out, and it gave it a playful feel. It was fun, and I think we were all feeling more confident than we did just because. This was an old song, but we made it new. I attacked the vocal with wild abandon, repeating words and changing the melody. The audience would have loved it. We were having a blast, and it showed, but the real standout was Good Rockin' Tonight. This was the song that proved I could do it again. I took an old rhythm and blues track and turned it into something new. I sped it up, repeated lines, and added my own flair. The band and I were on fire. It was raw and powerful, and it felt like we were making history. Billboard even noticed, saying I was a sock new singer who could appeal to country, R&B, and pop. I was proving that I could do it all country, rock, and everything in between. A few months later, I did my first big live performance at the Louisiana Hayride. I was a little nervous at first, but once I started singing, I was in my element. I sang both sides of my first single, That's All Right and Blue Moon of Kentucky. The crowd went wild, and I could feel their energy. I made a few changes to the songs, adding some extra emphasis and playing with the melody. It was a great night, and it only made me more excited about what was to come. In November or December, I recorded another single, but it wasn't as strong as the others. Milk Cow Blues Boogie had a funny mid-song tempo change, but it didn't have the same drive as my earlier hits. The B-side, You're a Heartbreaker, sounded a bit old-fashioned. I was trying new things, but not everything worked. In January 1955, we recorded some radio demos while on the road. We did Shake, Rattle, and Roll twice, and the second version was way better. I was more engaged, and the band was really cooking. We also did Fool, 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 a straight blues number. It was a fun, informal session, and you could hear us laughing and having a good time. By this point, My live shows were getting a lot of attention. I was covering more songs and getting bigger crowds. The press was calling me the fastest rising country music star in the nation. I was still the same guy, but I was working hard and loving every minute of it. In February, I recorded Baby Let's Play House. This was a huge step forward. I was completely comfortable with the sound I had developed, and the song was full of energy. I changed some of the lyrics to make it more relatable, like singing about a pink Cadillac. It was a hit, and Billboard called it a highly distinctive country effort with great rhythm. I was on my way, and I knew it. The future was looking bright. After recording Baby Let's Play House, I went back into the studio a month later to work on the B-side. I'm Left, You're Right, She's Gone. This time, things were a bit different. We had a drummer, Jimmy Lott, joining us, and the song was an original by local guys Stan Kessler and Bill Taylor. We tried it both fast and slow, but Sam Phillips, our producer, chose the faster version for this single. The slow version, which didn't have any drums, wasn't released until much later. It wasn't really a blues song, just slower and a bit off. The fast version was okay, but it didn't really stand out like some of the other songs we had done. Billboard, a music magazine, wasn't too impressed. They said it was a country chant, but the content wasn't great. By the spring of 1955, I was getting more and more popular. I was playing big shows, and even Billboard noticed. They said I pulled a terrific crowd at the Dallas Sportatorium in April. One of my performances from March 5th was recorded, and it sounded better than some of the earlier live stuff. The band had grown to 5 people, with Jimmy Day on steel guitar and Floyd Kramer on piano. Floyd's piano added a nice touch, even though it didn't always fit some of the songs. We played 6 songs, mostly covers, and the crowd really got into it. One of the best was Hearts of Stone. We also played Little Mama, a fast-paced R&B song that I really enjoyed. On March 19th, I played at Eagles Hall in Houston, and it was a great night. The band and I were really feeling it. We played Good Rockin' Tonight and Baby Let's Play House, and they were as good as the studio versions. I even made a joke that got a big laugh, but it was a bit naughty. This one's called Little Darling, You Broke My Heart When You Went Away, but I'll break your jaw when you come back. It was wild, and the crowd loved it. In April, we played in Gladewater, Texas, and the sound was much better. We only have one song from that night, Tweedledee, but it shows how much more confident I was on stage. In May, we played in Meridian, and the recording of That's All Right is one of the hardest rocking performances I ever did. We also played other songs that night, but we don't have recordings of them, like Mess Around and Rock Around the Clock. In July, we had another big studio session. Sam Phillips wanted me to try a song called I Forgot to Remember to Forget. It was a bit slower than what we usually did, but the sound was getting more polished. We also recorded Mystery Train and Trying to Get to You. Mystery Train was a big change from the original. We sped it up and made it rock harder. Trying to Get to You was a great song, and I even played some piano, though you can barely hear it. These songs were meant for the next single, but things changed. By August, I was getting even more popular. At the Big D Jamboree in Dallas, they said I was getting hotter and hotter. We don't have a recording of that show, but we do have some from August and October. The August 20th show at the Louisiana Hayride was really good. I joked around with the host and the audience, and we played That's All Right and Maybelline with a lot of energy. The October show had the best sound quality, and we played I Forgot to Remember to Forget. In November, things were a bit shaky. My manager, Bob Neal, and this guy called Colonel Tom Parker were fighting over who would manage me. We had a studio session to try to get a new song for the next single, but it didn't go well. We worked on When It Rains, It Really Pours, but it just didn't sound right. A few days later, Colonel Parker signed me to a big deal with RCA, and that was the end of the Sun Records era. The Sun recordings are really important because they show how I started. They were new and exciting, but they were just the beginning. I hadn't lived through a lot of what I was singing about yet, and that changed as I got older. The Sun recordings were about sound and energy, but later, I would add more emotion and depth to my music. In 1956, I was signed to RCA and had a new manager, Colonel Tom Parker. I was excited but didn't know what was coming. The first thing was a new studio session in January. We started with I Got a Woman, which I had been performing for a while. We had more musicians this time, and it took a few tries to get it right. The 8th take was the one we used. It wasn't the best version I ever did, but it was solid, and it showed that I was ready for the next big step in my career. After the recording of I Got a Woman, I got back to another song I had been playing live for the past year, Money Honey. By this time, I was in my element, and the track had a lot more energy than I Got a Woman. Floyd Kramer's piano really helped drive each verse, but it was my familiarity with the song that made it stand out. I could focus on telling the story with my voice, not just singing the lyrics. There weren't any big risks or changes to the song. It was pretty much the same as how I performed it live, and how the Drifters did it originally. In between I Got a Woman and Money Honey, I recorded Heartbreak Hotel, which would become my breakthrough single. I had promised Me Axton, one of the songwriters, that I would record it. The song was based on a newspaper clipping, and took just about 20 minutes to write. For the recording, I stuck pretty close to the demo version, which featured DJ Glenn Reeves. I didn't feel the need to change it much, because the structure and rhythm were already strong. I just sped it up a bit, added an instrumental break, and made the overall sound a bit harsher, especially in the transition to the final chorus. Heartbreak Hotel was a unique song. It had elements of blues and rock, and even a jazz-like piano solo by Floyd Kramer. The lyrics were pretty dark, and the master take had an eerie feel to it, partly because of the heavy reverb on my vocals. It was like singing in a fog, but it worked. The song spoke to the teenagers of 1956, but could have fit in a 1940s film noir. It was my first big hit, and showed how much my ballad singing had improved since 1954. At the first RCA session, I recorded 2 ballads, I'm Counting on You and I Was the One. I'm Counting on You was important because it was the first song by Don Robertson, who would write some of my best ballads later. The song had a solid arrangement with a triplet beat and Floyd Kramer's chugging piano. It was a much fuller sound than my Sun recordings. On I Was the One, my voice sounded stronger than ever, but there were moments where it seemed a bit overdone, like I was doing an impression of myself. Some critics noticed this and wrote about the irony in my singing, saying it was both fake and genuine at the same time. I was still figuring out who I was as an artist and developing my own sound. On January 28, 1956, I made my TV debut on Stage Show, hosted by Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey. The show wasn't doing well in the ratings, and my appearance was announced a month in advance. The hosts were old-fashioned, which made my performances stand out even more. I sang a medley of Shake, Rattle and Roll, and Flip, Flop and Fly, followed by I Got a Woman. I was relaxed and genuine, even though I was chewing gum during the first show. I Got a Woman rocked more than the studio version. Heartbreak Hotel was finally performed on the 3rd show, but it didn't go as smoothly as I hoped. The Dorsey band lost their timing, and the end of the song was a mess, but I stayed calm and didn't panic. The arrangement gave a hint of the sound I would achieve for the King Creole soundtrack a couple of years later. The remaining shows went well, and my confidence grew each week. Despite the low ratings, I was getting some attention. Wanda Calvert wrote that I was real different, and that people liked my unique style, and record sales proved it. There were some negative reactions, though. One columnist, Jas W. Atkins, was not a fan. He criticized my performance for being too wild, and suggested turning off the TV when I appeared. But overall, I was causing little controversy, beyond a few raised eyebrows. The trade journal Motion Picture Daily called me an abandoned performer who played and sang like Marlon Brando should have in Guys and Dolls. Even with high-profile guests like Ella Fitzgerald, the show couldn't improve its ratings and was canceled in the summer of 1956. Just 2 days after my TV debut, I was back in the studio. The sessions were booked because Steve Scholes at RCA wasn't satisfied with the earlier recordings. I covered Blue Suede Shoes, which I approached with wild abandon, making it more energetic and driving. Scotty Moore's guitar solos were scorching. Next, I updated another Arthur Crudup song, My Baby Left Me. I sang it in a higher register, giving it a cry-like quality that made the lyrics more believable. It was a strong blues number that appealed to teenagers. I also recorded So Glad You're Mine, another crewed-up song. I changed the arrangement a lot, turning it into a mid-tempo rocker. The lyrics were a bit nonsensical, but that didn't matter. It was about the sound and feel. I even altered some of the lyrics. One-sided love affair, and I'm gonna sit right down and cry over you were pleasant but a bit cutesy and bland. I'm gonna sit right down and cry over you was a Roy Hamilton song, and I gave it a rhythmic bounce. The sessions wrapped up with Tutti Frutti, Lottie Miss Claudie, and Shake, Rattle, and Roll. Lottie Miss Claudie was the best of the three, with a memorable piano introduction and a straightforward, enjoyable cover of Lloyd Price's original. It was a track that would stick around in my live performances for years. These sessions were a mix of hits and misses, but they showed how much I had grown as an artist. My voice was getting stronger, and I was finding my own sound. The pressure was on, but I was ready to take on the world. I remember those days when I was just starting out. In January and early February, I was in the studio with my band, trying to capture what we had been doing on stage. We recorded Tutti Frutti and Shake, Rattle, and Roll, which were pretty much the same as the original versions, but had that special something that made them ours. Shake, Rattle, and Roll was just like the radio demos and live shows from 1955, but we had to cut out one verse because it was a bit too risque for the time. When all the studio work was done, my first album, simply called Elvis Presley, was put together. It wasn't just about the music. It was also about the iconic black and white photo of me on stage and the pink and green lettering on the cover. People remember the album for what it represented, not just for the songs, but the songs, well, they were a mixed bag. We included some older tracks like I Love You Because, which didn't quite fit with my new style. It sounded like a different singer compared to the rest of the album. We also added some other songs from my earlier recordings, like Just Because and Trying to Get to You, which were better than I Love You Because. The critics had a lot to say about my album. They compared me to Johnny Ray, a singer who had been popular a few years earlier. Johnny was known for his emotional performances and a bit of controversy on stage, much like what I would become known for later. The New York Times even gave my album a good review, saying that my ballads were startling, hair-raising, and thoroughly provocative. But not everyone was as positive. Some writers called me controversial and said I was more of a gimmick than a real talent. Over in the UK, there wasn't much written about me, but when they did, they often talked about my poor background and my new wealth. One writer quoted me saying, "Look at all these things I got. I got 3 Cadillacs. I got 40 suits and 27 pairs of shoes." It was a big change from where I came from. Heartbreak Hotel was climbing the charts, and I was getting more and more popular. I was even on TV, including a show with Milton Berle. He made me feel at home, and we did a skit together. I was more playful on that show, and it was a fun experience, but not everything was smooth sailing. I had a 2-week gig in Las Vegas, and it didn't go well. The audience wasn't ready for me, and I wasn't ready for them. The show was a flop, but at least we got some good recordings from my final performance there. Then I was back on the road, and one of the best shows I did was in Little Rock, Arkansas. The sound quality of the recording isn't perfect, but it captures the raw energy of my performances. I was getting more confident, and my shows were getting wilder. I remember the drum solo in Blue Suede Shoes, and how I played with the word well in I Got a Woman. It was like I was already preparing for the 1970s. The local newspaper said the auditorium was in pandemonium when I finally showed up, 2.5 hours late. The kids were screaming, and it was a wild night. It wasn't just about the music, it was about the whole experience. Sometimes things got a bit too wild. I remember a show in Kansas where the crowd rushed the stage, and we had to stop. My drummer was thrown into the orchestra pit, and my coat was torn off. It was crazy, but I took it in stride. I told my mom, "If you're gonna be like that, you better not come along, because that stuff is going to keep right on happening." It was all part of the journey, and I was just getting started. By June 1956, I was a whirlwind, a force of nature that no one quite knew how to handle. My second appearance on the Milton Berle Show was a turning point. I sang I Want You, I Need You, I Love You, and it was smoother, less stiff than the studio version, but what everyone talked about was Hound Dog. I slowed it down, did some bump and grind moves, and the world went wild. People were shocked, and it wasn't just about my music anymore. It was about how I moved, how I looked, and what I represented. Back then, TV was still new. Families gathered around it, like a sacred family altar. But I wasn't the only one who made them uncomfortable. Milton Berle had been doing his thing for years, and he was already under fire for being too bawdy, too suggestive. When I came on his show and did my thing, it was the last straw for a lot of people. Critics like Jack Good, who had already been on Berle's case, now turned their sights on me. They called me a male burlesque dancer, a male Marilyn Monroe, and said my performances were suggestive and vulgar. They were scared of what I represented, scared that I was corrupting their kids. I didn't mean to cause all that fuss. I was just being me, having fun, and the music was just a part of it. The real Elvis phenomenon was becoming more about the spectacle, the event, the merchandise, and the hype. Even back in 1956, my manager, Colonel Tom Parker, was selling postcards and souvenirs to anyone who would listen. It was all part of the package. The critics kept coming after me. They said I was a bad influence, that I was taking advantage of teenagers, and that my music was nothing more than a cheap thrill. But the truth is, I was just a young guy from the country, trying to make it in a world that was changing fast. I was a commodity, a product, and a phenomenon, all rolled into one. And that's how it stayed even after I was gone. Looking back, I think it's clear that the real issue wasn't just me. It was about how TV was changing, how music was changing, and how America was changing. I was just the lightning rod, the face of a revolution that was already happening. And even though the critics tried to tear me down, the kids kept coming back. They saw something in me that the adults didn't, and that's what kept me going. In the end, I was more than just a singer or a performer. I was a symbol of a new era, a new way of thinking, and a new kind of entertainment. And that's how I'll be remembered even now, decades after I'm gone.